The healthcare industry, from routine checkups to life-saving surgeries, is heavily relied upon by the majority of the human population. And while current processes are tried and true, the opportunities that exist through digitization cannot be discounted. From improved service processes to enabled healthcare workers, the movement towards digital and mobile systems is already largely afoot. But how do we speed up the process, and what recent innovations already exist that can help in this transition? That's exactly what we'll be talking about on this episode of Anyline, Anytime. Hello and welcome everyone to what is the most anticipated podcast in recent months. Welcome to the episode. My name is Mark Babin, and as always, it's a pleasure to have you all watching and listening today. As you would have gathered from the title and introduction, we are talking about how optical character recognition, OCR, is set to drive digital transformation throughout the healthcare industry as they make big strides in digitizing all processes, from data collection to patient care, and even the operational processes happening behind the scenes. Now, of course, I cannot handle this topic on my own, nor would I ever want to. So I am pleased to welcome two very special guests and honored to have them on the episode. First, please welcome Dr. Daniel Schneider, General Manager at Crew, a Germany-based digital healthcare company that is leading the way forward when it comes to giving patients access to first-class medical care anywhere, anytime, through digital teleconsultations. Also joining the discussion today is Uwe Hortzman, the general partner and co-founder at Project A, an operational VC that partners with forward-thinking entrepreneurs who operate on the frontiers of digital innovation. Gentlemen, welcome to the podcast. It's an honor to have you both here and an honor to pick your brains a little on this subject matter. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Thanks, Mark. Good to be here. Just one comment quickly. Yes, we are in Germany. We're originally a Swedish company, also present obviously in Sweden, Norway, UK, and France, and a few other countries with smaller offerings.
Hence the name a little bit, I guess.
Yes, that's Swedish, and basically means something like healthy, fit. So it's probably one of the nicest startup names you can find because it's short. In the UK and France, though, it's called Livy because sometimes also those names don't run well in all languages.
Absolutely. Well, great to have you here. Thank you so much. And Uwe, thank you so much for joining us as well.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I think the first takeaway for the listeners already, finally, how to pronounce the name Crew and where does it come from. But yeah, looking very much forward to the session with you, Mark, and with Dr. Schneider here.
Absolutely. An embarrassingly long amount of time for me to get that pronunciation right. So thank you so much for that. And I love the little background. That's perfect. So again, thank you both for being here. So let's start by speaking about the way in which processes are typically completed in the medical world. Now, I know from our previous conversations and of course, personal experience, that traditional processes and documentations are largely paper-based. Daniel, as a professional in the industry, can you give some more perspective on why this is still largely the case? Is it just the sheer size of the processes we're dealing with?
Yeah, I think first of all, we have to understand that things like documentation and transmission of information to other people is vital to healthcare and has always been vital, right? I mean, if we talk about how a health practitioner hands over instructions to create a specific medicine to a pharmacist, this is something that isn't new, that's hundreds of years old. And of course, that information is extremely important because you want to get it right and it needs to be the right amount of every substance. And that's the same to some extent today, right? I mean, whether it's prescriptions or instructions to other doctors, healthcare providers, it needs to be accurate. And by definition, that in most cases means you don't want to tell the patient and hope he repeats it. You want to hand them a piece of paper. And what we've seen, obviously, is that there is the start of digitalization. It depends a lot on the country. Some countries are further than others. I think in Germany, we are realizing that we really need to catch up here. But we see that there's still a lot of paper floating around. Actually, I wish this was a joke, but it's probably the case that in Germany, fax machines are like still incredibly present in the healthcare industry. You could probably argue the healthcare industry is keeping fax machines alive. And that shows you how important paper still is here. And I think we're going to talk a bit later about how that is about to change. But it's still that important. And is that simple of scale? No, it's because it needs to be so accurate, and that's how the system has worked in the past.
Okay. So it definitely sounds like overall then the healthcare industry definitely wants to move forward. They want to take those steps forward. But again, given the massive amount of processes and the interconnectedness of everything, like you're saying, there just hasn't been that much progress to date. But again, we're looking maybe more regionally is kind of what you're saying.
We're looking more regionally, but we're also looking at something else that's specific about healthcare. It's not just the accuracy. I think one other important thing is confidentiality. So whatever we do in healthcare, we need to be 100% certain that the information only gets to the people that are authorized to see it. And that, quite frankly, a piece of paper, if the patient carries it from A to Z, that is at least, let's say, the patient has control of that piece of information. Now, the moment you digitalize it, we all know there are other risks coming up, and I'm not even talking intentionally malicious behavior. I mean, we've seen occasionally that just pieces of information drop into systems and authorizations aren't set right. So I think that's one of the reasons, like getting this right makes this harder. And that's what we're seeing happening more and more. And there's lots of interesting technologies over the last years that make this better and better, but rolling it out is not an easy and quick process.
Yeah, I know. I think that sets the stage really nicely for our conversation because it's not an easy process, but perhaps there are ways in which this can be eased. So really nice points. And thank you so much for that detail. Uwe, I'd love to bring you in on this point as well. Now, from your VC perspective, obviously having partnered with Crew, you've made the investment in getting the ball rolling when it comes to digitizing the healthcare industry. Why is this such an important thing for Project A and the work that you guys are moving towards?
I mean, we've been in this venture capital world here in Europe for quite a while, you know, and maybe 10, 15 years ago, this was all about, we're building e-commerce stores for something new, right? I mean, that was the amount of innovation that was happening, very simplified, but at a certain point in time. So I think, first of all, it's great that now we have an ecosystem that is still developed, a talent pool, pool of capital as well, that people can tackle really tough challenges, like, for example, bringing change to the healthcare system. I think Daniel already, pointed out some things around why that needs to change and how that should change. From our perspective, I mean, first of all, as cold and harsh as this may sound, we are, of course, in there to make money, right? Because we do think it's one of the biggest industries that is definitely ripe for disruption. Also, in certain instances, it's an industry that was really hesitant to change, or probably still is hesitant. But of course, it's massive, so there's opportunity. I think specifically we are looking for opportunities where it is not only about cold hard money, but where actually we see that we can, for example, generate efficiency gains that are for the benefit of everyone, right? Because if you look at healthcare systems, and a lot of complaints are being done, for example, about the German healthcare system. I'm actually a fan. I think it's a great system in terms of being in a position to balance, to make sure that costs don't explode more than they should and more than they do anyway. But it is a good balancing system. At the same time, I think specific changes can be made, specific disruptions can be introduced to the mix, not replacing everything, but to the mix of tools that we have as a healthcare system. And we would like to identify the ones that are commercially viable, scalable, because those two things are really connected. You can only scale something that is viable in itself, really, without wasting money and doing something that's not really sensible. We would like to combine those economic, interesting opportunities with also some that have true positive impact. Because if you build a healthcare company that is integrated in the system, that is medically sound, that is economically sound, you probably have the best chance as an entrepreneur in these times to affect the lives of thousands, of hundreds of thousands, of millions even. And we're talking about real quality of life. We're not talking about an e-commerce store. It makes me more convenient to get something delivered. We're talking about something that definitely people who are affected by real medical situations would probably rate as my number one driver of quality of life. And that, of course, for us is what's defining investments in that space. The combination of being economically and medically sound as well as really having the impact of touching people's lives in a positive way. Because not all digital innovation does that, to be really honest with you.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that's where that operational side of your firm really strives, I guess, because you want to be involved rather than just here's a check. You want to be involved in the growth of things, correct?
We want to be, yes. So what you're alluding to is that we have, which is a bit unusual for venture capital firms, we have 100 people, operational experts that work with us, and they are available to teams, to executives, to decision takers like Daniel, for example. One thing is important. We want to be involved, yes and no. Of course, we want to be helpful. We want to bring something to the table, but it's really up to the teams if they think now is the right time, right? So us wanting to be involved shouldn't be confused with us forcing ourselves
Correct.
or pushing our way in, right? So we would definitely like to figure out what are the ways we can be helpful to that endeavor, and then we'll do that. So yeah, yes, we want to be involved, but in a respectful and helpful manner.
Absolutely. No, very well said, and completely agree from our end as well. So Daniel, coming back to obviously the importance of moving things forward, when we look at the business of digitized healthcare, and obviously with your extensive background in the industry itself, can you shed some light on just how important digitizing healthcare processes are, especially in this era of innovation, this modern age that we live in?
Yeah, I want to build on top of what Uwe said.
Please.
I think not only is the case that, I mean, healthcare is, like he said, something that touches everyone, right? I mean, all of us are getting sick at some point. All of us are needing help at some point in our life. It's a fact of life, ultimately. And in that sense, where we usually start is with the patient. How can we make things better for the patient? And if you think about experiences that probably all of us have had, which is the disconnected of information. So you're coming to one doctor and they just don't have access to all the information of your medical history. That's one very typical use case. And because how medical profession works, you have different specialists, you have hospitals, you have the general practitioner, you have a dermatologist, or whatever else you need. And making that flow work better, I think, is a very obvious opportunity for digitalization to improve them. Now, in our business, we're primarily in video consultations, although we are starting to venture into other things. For example, in Sweden, we're running our own clinics. In the UK, we're also working on technical solutions for doctor-patient interaction. So there's more and more things coming, but ultimately it's the same, right? So if I have a conversation with a doctor through a video consultation, making the information of other interactions available there is very important. But then also, like I said, if you go to the pharmacy, it should be as easy as possible to get your medication without paper, because paper is always a disruption if you have digital processes. It's kind of like it's you're breaking the medium. You would like to have a fluid flow of digital information, and suddenly the doctor who's talking to you through the phone needs to hand you a piece of paper. That obviously doesn't really work well, and that's a challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's kind of exactly breaking that cycle, like you said, causes that disruption and perhaps limits that future steps, because we go, oh, well, we need this to be in paper form. So it almost limits it a little bit. No, it's a great point. So tying things together a little bit, I know from our relationships with various healthcare providers, the ability to digitize, and this is kind of like what you're saying, Daniel, but it really relies on a simplified process that empowers healthcare staff to do more, from nurses and technicians to doctors and medical staff. The simpler the things are, the more empowered they can be to do more things, more important things. So Uwe, bringing you into this, obviously Project A and Anyline, now we've been working together for quite a while, but it does seem like this main point echoes a lot of the same challenges from the various other industries that we support. So do you see what kind of the work that we do with this mobile data capture and OCR technology, do you see that perhaps as a stepping stone for this digital transformation in healthcare?
I mean, it has to be, right? Because what Daniel said, I think is fundamentally right. So he describes all the trends, and from our perspective, one thing that probably unites a lot of things in healthcare is we are moving towards a more patient-centric system, right? So from various perspectives, because maybe patients, or as we call it in other business, consumers, just get more empowered and more informed and take more decisions. They have more data sources and information sources available, but also because when we think more, when we rethink healthcare more outcome oriented, more evidence based, more outcome oriented. We care more about what actually helped as opposed to what services were delivered. But then everything has to move more patient-centric. More patient-centric cannot happen with being more integrated in terms of data. It's just not possible, right? Because the first person that suffers from those broken information chains through using different mediums, mostly paper, are the patients. They are the people who suffer the most. There are statistics out there, maybe taken with a grain of salt. We sometimes read there are more people dying in Germany every year from wrong doses of medications than from car accidents. And you would think car accidents, that has to be the number one killer. Even if the number, is maybe hard to get by and so on, and it might not be exactly right and it's a bit provocative, but one thing is certain: patients are dying because of information mismatches. People are dying because we don't have an integrated data system. And that's quite interesting because we have this long debate about, does digitization, is that actually basically a problem when it comes to data privacy? Also something that Daniel mentioned earlier, right? And we have, specifically in Germany, sometimes this notion, and I get the concerns and so on, but that's not really the debate. We need to figure out that debate, I agree, but the more important thing is here that we can save lives, I think, by having better data integration. Now, we have obviously massive heritage as well as massive parts of the healthcare system that are still paper-based, and we need to find ways to get there digitally. So OCR, one way or another, making paper-based stuff digitally understandable has to be a big step forward. It could be just to get our current processes running, but also just imagine the wealth of information that we have in terms of old records, old documentation, and so on. We don't even begin to understand what kind of medical knowledge we could still derive from that. We don't even know what awesome off-label use effects of medications, for example, we would be able to discover if we would fully digitize our joint medical brain that is currently in random papers everywhere. Now, obviously, that is a big lofty goal, but and maybe it will never be done 100%. But I do think it's really worthwhile investing ambition into that, and it has to work with OCR. So for us, quite clearly, Anyline initially was an investment where we thought more about industrial use cases, but that connection to the healthcare space actually makes more and more sense to me. So I'd love to see more stuff happening there. I'd love for us to have a conversation about how digitization of data, for example, can be done in a way that we protect individuals. We don't really care about, is Uwe, a person that has this specific disease. We care about a male 35 German, with maybe this and those preconditions reacted in that way to things. Can we see patterns? So those are very different discussions. They're tough discussions because the general public often doesn't understand, and there are people who are trying to drive that discussion into a different way because they have different interests. But I do think that data capture and OCR is one of the core stepping stones in getting there. There are other ones, and hopefully one day we won't need as much OCR anymore. But I think until then, a lot of time will pass. And then we haven't even talked about, as I mentioned before, all the wealth of data that we have rotting away somewhere in some basement in files. And there could be cure for disease in there. There could be dangerous implications there of things that we've been doing wrong. We should give scientists access to this data one way or another. And for that, we have to digitize it.
Yeah, and allowing them the ability to look at this data raw rather than having to spend days down in a basement, like you said, trying to find something to just have it at your fingertips seems like a natural step. I mean, it should be where we're at. But again, with what we've spoken about, it's not there yet. So as first steps, yeah, I completely agree. Daniel, coming to you, obviously from the front end and the one kind of working in the industry and looking at it as a whole, does this do these thoughts align with what you see as well as taking first steps? Do you see that usefulness?
Yeah, I think Uwe made a very strong point about the question of how do we get access to all of this existing documentation. What all of us are trying to do is evidence-based medicine, right? So what do you need evidence? You need the data, you need the access to that information. There is, of course, I'm pretty sure there's going to be tons of challenges. So if you look back, just a few back, you will find a lot of handwritten stuff. So OCR doesn't get easier here. It's going to get harder the more you move back. Doctors' notes are famously hard to read.
Right? I'm going to bring that up.
Let's be realistic here. It's not going to be easy, right? And it requires a lot of good skills. And even if you there's also picture material that you somehow need to process and analyze. Now today we have way better image recognition tools to analyze results from different, whether it's X-rays or anything else. Like we're getting better at this. Now that's kind of like the way. How do you get access to the past, right? I mean, that's kind of like what we're talking to. It's almost like an archival work. But I think Uwe is absolutely right that there could be lots of interesting stuff and insights in there. Now the second thing is how do we move forward today? And I think there is definitely something as kind of a bridge technology, where you say, obviously, in the mid to long term, we want to have an ability that the doctors actually enter everything into a digital system, or that any healthcare practitioner who's part of the process not only has read ability, but also write ability on the digital side. But what happens in between? What happens at the point where this breaks for whatever reason, because one of them isn't up to the new system yet, or because one of the processes isn't integrated yet? And then, of course, you always go back to the lowest technology, right? That's kind of like there's this natural path that if one person is using paper, everyone kind of has to use that piece of paper, unless you have a technology that basically pulls it back up again on the digital sphere. And that's where OCR definitely can play a role. I'm not sure if that's an easy way to go, because you need to integrate with a lot of complicated systems. But technologically, we're probably there. We're probably better equipped now than we've been for ever. So it's time to, I mean, if you have a fax machine, you already digitalized some of it, right? I mean, that's the funny part. Just to print it out again on paper. Or create a PDF, like why don't you do more with that? There are ways of doing that, and some people are doing it, but there's still a lot of paper floating around in healthcare offices.
Yeah, and I think there always will be. It's kind of that one step forward, two steps back. Like you said, you type something on a computer and then you print it out on paper. You've just done something taking a decade backwards, but really great point. So I guess looking at obviously the responsibility for this change, Uwe, I want to come to you on this. Obviously, as an operational VC and someone who provides investment support to companies like Crew, to companies like Anyline, obviously we're working to make steps forward. The vast amount of innovation, like we're speaking about, the fact that we are there at that point today is largely because of the support from companies like you that provide that support to get us there, that innovation can actually proceed. Is that how you see it, that you're part of the process to get us going, to allow innovation to happen?
I mean, we do see ourselves as obviously, or us as an industry. I do think that industry is important, the venture capital industry, to make that kind of stuff happen, because money has got to come from somewhere. That being said, people who don't really know that industry well, they are probably like influenced by Shark's Tank, Höhle der Löwen, those kind of TV shows. They think like investors sit there on beautiful tables and entrepreneurs come begging for money, and then they are kind of in front of our feet at our mercy, and then we decide. That's not how the world looks like. If anything, it's the opposite. So we see ourselves in a constant battle to provide a better product to people like two of you. I mean, we need to be competitive because the entrepreneurs who will tackle those tough challenges, they will have and they should have many options where to get their capital from. So we need to figure out what do we need to do to be allowed to play a role? What do we need to do to be allowed to invest? How can we be helpful to make sure that people give us a chance? That's how we see it, right? So it's not because of our grace innovation is happening. That innovation is happening anyway. We need to make sure, can we play a role, and how can we innovate about ourselves so that we are allowed to get on board those rocket ships, as we were lucky to do with both Anyline and Crew. But unfortunately, on that success, we can't build for too long, but we'll have to keep innovating on ourselves as well. Otherwise, we're going to be left behind eventually.
Yeah, of course. And I know that obviously the financial, but the operational support, I know it's meant a great deal to our team and the innovation that has just propelled us in the last year. And I know, Daniel, coming to you, I guess that it must mirror the same for you. Having that support just gives you and your team much more ability to focus in what you guys want to be changing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a very, Uwe already said, it's a very unique way for VC to work, but I also think it's a very unique way for companies to interact with the VC. I mean, sometimes you have interactions with VCs that are limited to kind of like board meetings and networking. And I'm not saying that's not valuable, it is, but the good thing is Project A does that too. But we've worked with colleagues from Project A in Germany, in the other countries, and it's a good way of getting fast help and expertise. And then obviously every company needs to build up that expertise themselves. And the good thing is the incentive structure is nice, because Project A doesn't have an incentive to kind of like resell and resell and resell, because ultimately they want to make the company successful, because that's where most of the money for them is. And that makes the work quite nice, because if any one of you has worked with consultants or with support in other areas, their main incentive obviously is to make you a happy customer, to resell, and that's fine, that's their job. But it makes the situation a little different. Now, at the same time, I mean, if you look at healthcare, I think it's, like you said, it's financial support, operational support. Healthcare is a little special sometimes. I think in some startups, you can solve problems with people or with money. Just hire a bunch of interns and let's solve that problem with hands on deck. And that's sometimes true in healthcare too, but in a lot of cases, you also need to work within the system. You need to understand how policymakers can shift the landscape, and you need to be part of that. And I think that's something that makes healthcare a little special, to some extent interesting. I think it's an interesting field because so many people care about it. But it sometimes limits what you can do as a startup. It's probably one of the things that makes this different from a lot of other startups.
Yeah, absolutely. No, a really poetic way to kind of bring this to a close and everything together. I mean, we're definitely all aligned on the fact that the importance of moving the industry forward and what we're all contributing to that. I think we all hold some level of responsibility. Like you're saying, all of us have our own paths to the top of that mountain as we all push that needle forward a little bit more. But it's obviously relationships like this that when they're formed is when that magic happens and we can make these strides forward. So I love that we've come to that conclusion, and really great to discuss these points with you guys. So again, I appreciate you being here and I appreciate the insights. Before we wrap up, Daniel, any last final notes from your end?
Well, I think let's keep working on all of these things, right? I mean, this is I think Uwe. So I also used to work in a big e-commerce company a few years ago, and that was fun. And to be honest, it was also changing an industry. But I think Uwe has a great point that in changing healthcare, you're doing more than just building a business. And there's a few other areas where you can do that, and that's fine. And I think mobility can change how cities work, and food delivery can perhaps enable local farmers to sell easier. Like there's tons of interesting ways how you can make your business more than just a business in that sense, an economic interest. But for healthcare, it's very clear. And I think that's what drives a lot of people in our team. And I can only invite others to join us, whether doing their own companies or joining companies like ours. I think there's still lots of stuff to be done in healthcare to make everyone's life better and more healthy.
Completely agree. That's the ultimate goal. And Uwe, any final notes from you before we wrap up?
I mean, couldn't have said it better. Absolutely. The reward in all of this is just very big. I specifically like the aspect that, as I mentioned before, when we start digitizing, we might not even, probably the real gains that we get from that, we don't even understand yet, right? Mm-hmm. Because that's the promise of such a complex topic like medicine, where, a human brain isn't even able to process all the information. So we really need the help of digitization for developing new therapies, new medications, and so on. So if that's definitely motivating for us. And I think it's motivating for a lot of people. And that's why, it's typically like a good community and lots of good companies, lots of good people from all kinds of backgrounds, from diverse backgrounds, hopefully even more so in the future, are working on those.
And to our audience, thank you so much for being a part of this episode on this fairly in-depth look at the healthcare industry and, of course, the steps being taken to digitize many of the processes and those first steps. I think really what we touched upon today. And it's a nice to kind of get that overall look at where it can go and how it can get there. So again, thank you for joining us for this episode. I hope that if you are in the healthcare industry or developing the technologies for it, that this was inspirational. Again, if you have any questions or you simply wish to add to the conversation, perhaps a topic that you wanted to touch on more, or you want to add some insights into something we spoke about, please go ahead and leave those comments in the video below, or if you want to get in touch with any of us directly, of course, you can go ahead and do that. Our LinkedIn links are just above in the video description there. So you can go ahead and click on that and ask questions directly, or again, you can leave them in the comments and we'll get to them there. So again, a big thank you to our guests, Uwe and Daniel, for being with us today. Been an incredible talk, plenty to take away, and an honor to speak with both of them. So wishing everyone in the world a fantastic day, wherever in the world you may be. And as always, stay happy, stay healthy. I'll see you on the very next episode.